The day Karen cut the lock on my Jeep was the day she unknowingly stepped into a federal investigation. I wasn't home when it happened. I was at work, sitting through a routine meeting, when my phone started vibrating non-stop. At first, I ignored it. But when I saw 3 missed calls from my neighbor and a text that read, "You need to come home." HOA drama, I knew something was wrong. I checked my security camera app. There she was. Karen, vice president of the HOA, standing in my driveway with bolt cutters in her hands. My Jeep was parked exactly where it had been for months. Inside my locked private garage space. Behind a heavy-duty steel chain I had personally installed. And she was cutting through it. She looked confident. Smug, even. Like she was proving a point. I watched in disbelief as the chain snapped and fell to the ground. She waved over a tow truck driver who had been waiting just outside the gate. She pointed at my Jeep like she owned it. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that my Jeep wasn't just my vehicle. It was part of an active police task force operation. The Jeep had been temporarily assigned to me as part of a cooperative agreement with local law enforcement. It contained surveillance equipment, tracking documentation, and evidence linked to an ongoing investigation. And now, HOA Karen had just tampered with it. I grabbed my keys and drove home faster than I probably should have. By the time I arrived, the tow truck had already hooked up my Jeep. Karen stood nearby with her clipboard, speaking loudly so the small crowd of neighbors could hear. "This is what happens when people think the rules don't apply to them," she declared. I stepped out of my car calmly. "Karen," I said, my voice steady, "you really shouldn't have done that." She rolled her eyes. "Your vehicle violated HOA storage policy. It's being impounded." I glanced at the tow truck driver, who suddenly looked uncertain. "Did she show you proof she has authority to seize a vehicle from private property?" I asked him. Karen scoffed. "Don't intimidate contractors." Then I pulled out my phone. Not to argue, but to make one call. And within minutes, the entire tone of the afternoon shifted. Because when 2 unmarked police vehicles turned the corner and pulled up behind the tow truck, Karen's confident smile disappeared. This wasn't an HOA violation anymore. It was interference in a police investigation. And she had no idea what was coming next. The 2 unmarked police SUVs rolled in slowly, deliberately, like they had all the time in the world. But the tension in the air tightened instantly. The tow truck driver stepped back first. He wasn't stupid. The moment he saw those vehicles, he unhooked the chain from my Jeep and lowered it carefully back onto the pavement. Karen, on the other hand, still tried to stand tall. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp but slightly thinner than before. The first officer stepped out. Plain clothes. Badge visible. Calm expression. He didn't look at Karen right away. He looked at the Jeep. Then at the cut chain on the ground. Then at me. "Sir," he said evenly, "is this the vehicle?" "It is," I replied. Only then did he turn to Karen. "And who authorized you to access this vehicle?" Karen adjusted her blazer. "I'm the vice president of this HOA. This vehicle violated community storage regulations. We followed proper procedure." The officer crouched down and examined the broken lock. "Did you personally cut this chain?" She hesitated for half a second. "Yes. It was obstructing enforcement." The second officer stepped forward now. "Ma'am, this vehicle is registered under an active cooperative task force agreement. It contains protected investigative materials." Karen blinked. That's not possible. It's a personal Jeep." "It is privately assigned," the officer corrected calmly. "But it is currently under investigative jurisdiction." The small group of neighbors watching had gone silent. Karen's face shifted from defiance to confusion. "No one informed the HOA of that," she said quickly. We can't enforce rules if residents hide things. The first officer stood up slowly. Ma'am, you forcibly accessed secured property without authorization. You interfered with an active investigation. And you attempted to remove protected equipment. The words landed heavier with each sentence. I was enforcing community standards. Karen snapped, but the edge in her voice was gone now. The tow truck driver quietly stepped further away, pretending to check his phone. I folded my arms, staying silent. Because this wasn't about arguing anymore. It was about consequences. Sir, the second officer said to me, has the vehicle been compromised? I walked toward the Jeep and opened the rear compartment carefully. The interior equipment cases were still sealed. The dashboard camera unit was intact. No visible tampering beyond the lock, I said. The officer nodded. Then he looked at Karen again. You're going to need to provide identification. That was the moment it truly shifted. Not an HOA meeting. Not a warning. An official documentation process. Karen's confidence cracked visibly as she reached into her purse. Neighbors were whispering now. Phones were out. Recording. She glanced at me, and for the first time, there wasn't arrogance in her eyes. There was fear. Because she finally understood something. This wasn't about a parking violation. This was about crossing a line she didn't even know existed. And the paperwork was only just beginning. Karen handed over her ID with a hand that was no longer steady. The first officer examined it carefully, then nodded to his partner, who began writing in a small black notebook. No raised voices. No dramatic accusations. Just calm, procedural documentation. And somehow, that felt worse. What exactly is happening? Karen asked, trying to regain control of her tone. Surely this can be resolved without all of this. The officer looked at her evenly. Ma'am, cutting a private lock and attempting to seize a secured vehicle is not an HOA enforcement action. It's potential criminal interference. A murmur rippled through the neighbors. Criminal. That word hung in the cold afternoon air. Karen's jaw tightened. This is ridiculous. We have the authority to enforce compliance. The vehicle was improperly stored. I finally spoke. It was inside my assigned garage space. You modified the garage with that chain, she shot back. Yes, I replied calmly. With written approval. Which you signed off on last year. That hit. Her eyes flickered, just briefly. The second officer looked up from his notes. You authorized the modification. Karen hesitated. That's not relevant. It is, he said simply. Because if she had approved the modification, then cutting that lock wasn't enforcing policy. It was knowingly bypassing her own authorization. The first officer gestured toward the Jeep. We're going to photograph the damage and document the scene. He pulled out a department-issued camera. Click. The broken chain. Click. The cut lock. Click. The tow truck positioned behind the vehicle. Each photo felt like a nail sealing something shut. Karen shifted her weight, clearly aware that this was no longer a neighborhood dispute. This was evidence collection. I wasn't informed about any investigation, she repeated, softer now. That's correct, the officer replied. Because you weren't meant to be. Silence. The implication was clear. Task force operations don't send courtesy notices to HOA boards. The tow truck driver cleared his throat. Am I free to go? Yes, the officer said. You were acting under instruction. That part stung Karen too. The responsibility had just narrowed. She tried one more angle. I was protecting property values. That's my duty. Your duty, the officer said evenly, does not override state or federal law. Another note was written down. Another quiet mark in that little black notebook. I watched her carefully. This wasn't someone who expected consequences. This was someone used to controlling outcomes. But control was slipping. And she could feel it. The officer handed her back her ID. You'll likely be contacted for a formal statement. Do not alter any related records. Her eyes widened slightly. Records. Emails. Meeting notes. Enforcement logs. Everything suddenly mattered. As the officers began wrapping up, the reality finally settled over her face. This wasn't ending today. It was just beginning. By sunset, the entire neighborhood knew. Not because I posted anything. Not because the police made an announcement. But because nothing spreads faster than flashing lights and the word investigation. At 7:12 p.m., my inbox pinged. Subject: Emergency HOA board meeting, mandatory attendance. Karen had called it. I almost laughed. After everything that had happened that afternoon, she still believed she could manage this internally. Spin it. Reframe it. Maybe even blame me. The meeting was scheduled for 8 p.m. in the clubhouse. When I walked in, the room was already packed. Residents filled every chair. Some stood along the back wall. The board members sat at the long table up front, stiff and uncomfortable. Karen sat in the center. Her usual confidence was gone. Her posture was rigid. Her smile forced. She cleared her throat. As many of you may have heard, there was an incident earlier today involving a vehicle violation and a misunderstanding with law enforcement. A misunderstanding. I stayed quiet. She continued, the HOA was acting within its enforcement authority when we attempted to remove a non-compliant vehicle. One of the other board members shifted in his seat. He avoided eye contact with everyone. Karen pressed on. However, we were not informed that the vehicle in question was associated with outside parties. Murmurs filled the room. Outside parties. That was one way to describe a police task force. I finally stood up. With respect, I said calmly, you weren't informed because you weren't supposed to be. The room went still. Karen's eyes locked onto mine. You deliberately withheld information from the HOA, she accused. I followed the agreement I signed, I replied. Which includes confidentiality clauses. Another ripple of whispers. One resident raised her hand. Wait. Are you saying Karen cut your lock without checking anything? I held up my phone and projected the camera footage onto the clubhouse screen. There she was. Bolt cutters in hand. Clear as day. No vote. No notice. No due process. Just action. Gasps echoed across the room. Karen's face flushed red. The vehicle was in violation of storage guidelines. In my assigned garage space, I corrected. And you approved the chain installation, another board member said quietly, flipping through old records. The air shifted. For the first time, Karen looked cornered. This is being exaggerated, she insisted. The police overreacted. Before I could respond, the clubhouse doors opened. Two familiar figures stepped inside. The same officers from earlier. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. We're here to inform the board, one officer said evenly, that an official inquiry has been opened regarding today's events. The word official hit harder than anything else that night. The room fell completely silent. Karen didn't speak this time. Because she finally understood something. This wasn't an internal HOA matter anymore. And she no longer controlled the narrative. The officers didn't sit down. They stood at the back of the clubhouse, calm and composed, as if this were routine. For them, maybe it was. For the HOA board, it absolutely wasn't. We're not here to disrupt your meeting, the first officer said evenly. We're here to clarify jurisdiction. Jurisdiction. That word alone shifted the atmosphere from neighborhood politics to something far more serious. Karen straightened in her chair. "With respect, officer, this is a private community matter." "It stopped being private," he replied calmly, "when secured investigative property was accessed without authorization." A quiet gasp came from somewhere in the room. The second officer stepped forward slightly. "For clarity, the vehicle in question is registered under a cooperative task force assignment. Interference with such property may constitute obstruction." The word obstruction landed like a hammer. One of the board members, Mark, visibly paled. "Karen, you said this was just a parking enforcement issue." "It was," she snapped, but the sharpness in her voice now sounded defensive rather than authoritative. I remained standing near the side wall, arms relaxed, watching carefully. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about exposure. Exposure of how casually power had been used. A resident near the front spoke up. "Did the board vote on cutting his lock?" Silence. Another resident, "Was there written notice issued?" More silence. Karen shuffled through a folder of papers in front of her. Pages turned quickly, almost frantically. "The violation was ongoing," she said. "Immediate action was necessary." "Immediate action," the officer repeated slowly, "does not override legal boundaries." He wasn't aggressive. He didn't need to be. The facts were doing the work. Mark leaned toward Karen and whispered something urgently. She shook her head sharply. The second officer addressed the room. "We are not making arrests tonight. This is a documentation phase. However, all related digital communications, enforcement records, and authorization documents must remain unaltered." Digital communications. Emails. Internal HOA group chats. Text messages. Karen's face tightened slightly at that. Because now it wasn't just about what happened in the driveway. It was about what had been said before it happened. The first officer continued. "If any party attempts to delete or modify records related to today's incident, that will escalate the situation." Escalate. The word echoed in the stillness. Karen finally stood up. "This is intimidation." "No," the officer replied evenly. "This is procedure. There's something uniquely unsettling about calm authority. It doesn't argue. It doesn't shout. It simply defines reality." And in that moment, reality was no longer aligned with Karen's narrative. She looked around the room. For support. For reassurance. For control. But what she saw instead were neighbors avoiding her gaze. Board members shifting uncomfortably. Phones still quietly recording. Her authority hadn't disappeared in one dramatic explosion. It was dissolving quietly, piece by piece. And everyone could see it happening. The officers left shortly after delivering their warning. But the real damage didn't walk out with them. It stayed in that room. Karen resumed her seat slowly, but the energy had shifted completely. No one looked at her the way they had before. The authority she carried for years now felt fragile, almost artificial. Mark cleared his throat. "I think we need to review the documentation from earlier this week." Karen shot him a sharp look. "There's nothing to review." "There are emails," he replied quietly. The room stirred. Emails. It only took one resident to say, "Can we see them?" before the pressure became undeniable. Karen hesitated. "We don't need to publicize internal board communications." "You publicized his violation," someone in the back said. That landed. Mark slowly opened his laptop. "For transparency," he muttered. Karen leaned toward him. "This is unnecessary." "It's necessary now," he replied. The projector flickered to life again. The first email appeared on the screen. Subject: Jeep situation. Sent 3 days before she cut the lock. Karen's words were right there in black and white. He thinks being connected gives him special treatment. We need to make an example. The room went silent. Make an example. Another email. I don't care what agreement he claims to have. The board needs to assert authority. Then another. If we let this slide, others will challenge us. There it was. Not confusion. Not misunderstanding. Intent. Karen stood abruptly. Those messages are being taken out of context. Which context? A resident asked. The part where you approved his garage modification last year. Mark pulled up the approval form. Her signature was clearly visible. Dated. Stamped. Documented. She had known the chain was authorized. She had known the Jeep was stored in a designated space. And yet she chose to escalate. Not because of policy. Because of control. The quiet in the clubhouse was heavier now than it had been when the police were present. Because this wasn't external authority speaking. It was internal proof. Karen's voice lowered. I was maintaining standards. You were targeting a resident, someone replied. There's a difference. And everyone in that room could see it now. She glanced toward the door as if calculating an exit. But there wasn't one. Not socially. Not legally. Not reputationally. The board members exchanged looks. Mark finally said it. We may need legal counsel. Not for me. For them. Karen's jaw tightened. Because for the first time, this wasn't about defending a decision. It was about defending herself. And the emails she thought no one would ever read were now displayed in front of the entire community. The narrative had shifted completely. This wasn't enforcement. It was personal. And personal decisions carry consequences. The air in the clubhouse felt different now. Heavier. No one was whispering anymore. No one was confused. The emails had done something the flashing police lights hadn't fully accomplished. They removed doubt. Mark closed his laptop slowly. No dramatic gestures. Just quiet finality. I think, he said carefully, we need to discuss next steps. Karen's voice cut in quickly. The next step is waiting for legal guidance. No, a resident near the front replied. The next step is accountability. That word echoed through the room. Accountability. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was calm. Clear. Certain. Another board member, Denise, leaned forward. Karen, why didn't you bring this to a board vote before cutting the lock? I had authority to act, Karen replied sharply. Denise didn't look convinced. Authority doesn't mean immunity. The tension wasn't explosive. It was precise. Calculated. For years, Karen had controlled meetings with confidence. She knew Robert's rules of order better than anyone. She knew how to redirect, how to table motions, how to shut down dissent. But tonight, the room wasn't reacting the way she expected. It wasn't emotional. It was measured. And that's harder to fight. A resident stood up near the back. I move that we initiate a vote of no confidence in the vice president pending investigation. You could feel the shift instantly. Karen froze. That's completely inappropriate, she said. This is reactive and premature. Mark looked down at his notes. It's procedurally allowed. She turned toward him, stunned. You can't be serious. I am, he replied quietly. Denise nodded. Seconded. There it was. Motion made. Seconded. Karen's face drained of color. This is a witch hunt, she said, but the words lacked force. No, someone said calmly. It's governance. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen had spent years insisting on strict enforcement of bylaws. Tonight, those same bylaws were being applied to her. Mark addressed the room. All residents in favor of initiating a temporary removal vote pending legal review, raise your hands. Hands went up. Not all. But enough. Karen scanned the room desperately, counting silently. The majority was clear. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because there was nothing left to argue. This wasn't about the Jeep anymore. It wasn't even about the police investigation. It was about trust. And once trust fractures publicly, it doesn't repair quietly. Mark cleared his throat. The motion passes. No applause. No cheering. Just stillness. Karen slowly lowered herself back into her chair. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked small. Not powerless. But exposed. And exposure is far more damaging than defeat. Because defeat can be reframed. Exposure cannot. The vote didn't end the night. It changed it. Karen no longer sat at the center of the table. Mark had gently moved into the role of acting chair, following procedure as cleanly and formally as possible. There was no celebration in the room. No satisfaction. Just a quiet understanding that something serious had begun. Given the circumstances, Mark said carefully, the board will retain independent legal counsel to cooperate fully with the inquiry. Karen remained silent. That silence was louder than any argument she'd made earlier. By the next morning, formal letters were delivered. One to the HOA board. One to Karen personally. And one to me. The letter I received was straightforward, confirmation that my vehicle would undergo a security re-evaluation to ensure no breach of investigative materials had occurred. Standard procedure. Karen's letter, however, was different. I only learned the details later. She was required to provide a sworn statement. All digital correspondence related to enforcement actions over the past 6 months was to be preserved and submitted. Financial authorization logs were also requested. That part surprised people. Until it didn't. Because once investigators start looking at decision-making patterns, they rarely look at just one incident. They look for consistency. Or inconsistency. Within days, whispers began circulating. Other residents started reviewing their own violation notices. Some discovered inconsistencies in enforcement timelines. Others found fines issued without proper documentation. It wasn't chaos. It was scrutiny. And scrutiny is methodical. The HOA's attorney held a closed-door session with the remaining board members. When they emerged, the tone was sober. This was no longer a reputational inconvenience. It was liability. Karen attempted to send a community-wide email explaining her intent to protect property values. It was short. Polished. Carefully worded. But it avoided one key detail. She never acknowledged cutting the lock. She framed it as corrective action. Unfortunately for her, the video footage was still circulating privately among residents. Intent and evidence were no longer aligned. 2 weeks later, the official notice arrived. The inquiry had escalated into a formal review of obstruction and unlawful property access. No arrest. No dramatic headlines. Just official review. But that was enough. Karen requested temporary leave from her position. The board accepted. It was described as voluntary. But everyone understood the reality. Authority had shifted permanently. And what started with bolt cutters in a driveway had now moved into structured legal territory. There are moments when someone believes they're asserting control. And there are moments when that assertion reveals a deeper pattern. Karen thought she was making an example of me. Instead, she became one herself. Not because of the Jeep. Not because of the police. But because unchecked authority eventually collides with accountability. And accountability doesn't knock. It arrives quietly. Then stays. 3 months later, the Jeep was still parked exactly where it had always been. Same garage space. Same chain. New lock. But the neighborhood wasn't the same. The official findings were never dramatic. No courtroom spectacle. No televised arrest. Just paperwork. Structured conclusions. Measured consequences. The inquiry determined that Karen had knowingly exceeded HOA authority, improperly accessed secured property, and interfered with an active investigative assignment. While prosecutors declined to pursue criminal charges due to lack of material damage, the report made one thing very clear. Her actions were unauthorized and reckless. That single word, reckless, carried weight. The HOA's insurance carrier conducted its own review. Legal fees were assessed. Coverage terms were re-evaluated. The board was required to implement new oversight protocols for enforcement actions. Multiple signature approvals. Mandatory notice periods. Recorded votes. The era of unilateral decisions ended permanently. Karen officially resigned 2 weeks after the findings were released. Her resignation letter cited personal reasons. It did not mention the Jeep. It did not mention the police. It did not mention the emails. But everyone knew. Professionally, the consequences ran deeper. Karen worked in property management consulting, a role that relied heavily on trust, governance knowledge, and ethical enforcement practices. Word travels quietly in that industry. Contracts weren't renewed. Invitations stopped coming. Not because of rumors. Because of documentation. Reputation isn't destroyed by noise. It's dismantled by proof. As for me, life returned to normal. The task force operation concluded successfully weeks later. The Jeep was returned to standard registration. The surveillance equipment was removed. The case moved forward without further interference. But every time I park in that garage, I remember the moment she cut that lock. Not with anger. With clarity. Karen didn't fall because she made a mistake. She fell because she believed authority meant immunity. She believed rules were tools, flexible when convenient. But rules are frameworks. And frameworks apply to everyone. Even the people who enforce them. In the end, this wasn't a story about a Jeep. It wasn't even about an HOA. It was about boundaries. Legal boundaries. Ethical boundaries. Personal boundaries. The moment she crossed one, she assumed she could explain it away. What she didn't calculate was exposure. Exposure to evidence. Exposure to oversight. Exposure to a system far bigger than a neighborhood board.
She cut my lock thinking she was seizing control. Instead, she severed her own, and that's the thing about power. If you misuse it long enough, eventually it turns on you, not loudly, not dramatically, just decisively. And once it does, there's no bolt cutter in the world that can unavoid it.